Today we are going to get prepared to read from the autobiography of a gentleman named Olaudah Equiano. He was an enslaved person from West Africa during the 1700s. And in order to understand his experiences, you need to have a little bit of an idea of what he went through. So I'm going to show you this PowerPoint, which has some very powerful images of what it would have been like to have been an enslaved person at that time. And the title of this is The Middle Passage. By the end, you should be able to describe living conditions on board slave ships during the Middle Passage and describe slave resistance on board the slave ships. The slave trade is also known as the triangular trade because of the three journeys. The second part of the journey, when slaves were taken to the Americas, is sometimes called the Middle Passage. It's obvious that life on the Middle Passage was very difficult. Slaves were kept in cramped conditions, their diet was poor, and disease was common. Slave ship crews lived in fear of revolt. Slaves were normally kept chained to each other to make revolt or suicide harder. They were usually kept below decks, but were allowed out for fresh air and exercise. Sexual and physical abuse was not uncommon on ships. Conditions varied on each ship. Some believed in squeezing in as many slaves as possible. Others thought space made slaves more likely to live. Some slaves had no room in which to lie down or sleep. On many ships, slaves cleaned the decks and performed other tasks. Sometimes they had to dance or sing. Their diet was very poor, often consisting of little food, which itself was of low quality. Food was often rice or a type of porridge. Due to their poor diet and tight living conditions, disease was very common. Dysentery and yellow fever were common conditions. A real problem was that the cramped space meant that slaves were often covered in bodily fluids, such as urine, vomit, and feces. Slave revolts sometimes happen. Slaves might try to attack their captors and take control of the ship. These usually ended unsuccessfully, especially because the slaves did not know how to sail the ship. There are many examples of slave rebellions. The most famous is the Armistead Rebellion in 1839. The slaves took control of the ship, killing most of the crew. The slaves eventually went on trial, but were released as they had been kidnapped. Not all slave resistance involved violence against slave ship's crew. Sometimes slaves would jump overboard to prevent themselves being sold. Other times they would refuse food and starve themselves. Slave ship crews used various forms of punishment to stop slave rebellions. Like on land, the most common punishment was whipping. Other punishments included withholding food or torture, such as thumbscrews. There were more extreme punishments, too. This included throwing rebellious slaves overboard. Sharks terrified the crew, and slaves were known to follow slave ships due to dead bodies which were thrown overboard. So the question I have for you, to which you will respond today, is would you have resisted and rebelled? If yes, how? And be specific. Explain what you would do. If no, why not? What hope did you have? So at this point, you can watch the video that is attached to this assignment so that you get an idea of what Olaudah Equiano remembered during the Middle Passage.